Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in political science we will be discussing Brahmanic and Shramanic tradition in Indian political thought. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science in Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha has 25 years of teaching experience and his area of expertise lies in Indian political thought and political theory. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you and good afternoon. Today's discussion we are going to have on two different traditions from Indian political thought, particularly pertaining to the ancient period in terms of the temporal classification, and they are Brahmanic and the Shramanic traditions. Now, this Brahmanic and Shramanic tradition of political thought are important for understanding the whole range of ideas which basically are studied, interpreted in Indian political thought, particularly ancient Indian political thought, because these two traditions are basically crucial for understanding political thinking in India in that period. The Brahmanic tradition is also in fact sometimes referred as the classical tradition or orthodox tradition, and there are certain features of that tradition, largely on account of the fact that perhaps this was the dominant tradition at one point of time, and then it led to some reactions, some challenges originating from its own fold, and ultimately culminated into a very powerful discourse which is known as heterodox tradition, or what is also popularly called Shramanic tradition. Shramanic pertains to something which is moving, wandering, and also something which pertains to labor. So, therefore, these two traditions were pitted against each other, whereas this Brahmanic tradition normally applies to the two different types of sources through which this tradition derives its resources. One is the textual, another is basically the cultural, or one can say what is called in Sanskrit the Vyavaharik, something which is emerging from the kind of practice of this tradition. So, therefore, this Brahmanic tradition, in fact, when we talk of, there are different interpretations of this Brahmanic tradition. For example, what is this Brahmanic tradition is all about? Now, there are different ways to characterize this Brahmanic tradition. One is this orthodox versus heterodox, which I was mentioning. Another is Astic versus Nastic. Then there is also some interpreters or scholars or schools of thought who go by characterizing one as this otherworldly, otherwise, and the other one as this worldly, and then also a spiritual versus material. So, these are the different names through which these two traditions are recognized and interpreted. Now, orthodox pertains to this orthodoxy, that there are certain texts, there are certain themes around which this entire Brahmanic tradition revolve, and basically they do not want to make any modification or change in their position. So, therefore, some sort of orthodoxy one can find in their position vis-a-vis politics, vis-a-vis society, vis-a-vis economy, vis-a-vis their entire understanding of this entire world, universe. So, therefore, this orthodox tradition, and then the heterodox tradition, as it is often referred to, basically is a kind of interrogation of this orthodox tradition. And under this heterodox tradition, there are 3-4 important schools of thought which we will touch upon later. For example, Jainism and Buddhism are the two important schools of thought, particularly so far heterodox tradition is concerned. But then heterodox tradition is not homogeneous, as homogeneous as perhaps orthodox. Of course, orthodox also has a little bit of diversity which we will discuss later, but heterodox tradition is characterized by a lot of diversity. For example, on the one hand you have Jainism, you have Buddhism, you have materialism of Charvak, you have Goshala, Ajiveric, and so on and so forth. So, but materialism, crass materialism of Charvak, as well as certain other strands of thought or philosophy in India, for example, Buddhism and Jainism, and all of them are clubbed together under this heterodox tradition. Nonetheless, so far the Shramanic tradition, as it is often referred to, applies most particularly to these two schools of thought, Jainism and Buddhism. Then also there is a third way to look at it, is Astic versus Nastic, that classical tradition or the orthodox tradition or Brahmanic tradition is Astic, and another one is Nastic. So, atheist and the theist, the kind of restrictions which is basically prevent elsewhere also. Now, in context of this Indian tradition, what is normally referred to Astic is one which believes in the God or one which believes in infallibility of Vedas, whereas the Nastic tradition is referred to a tradition which does not believe in the God the way perhaps the Astic tradition believes, and also questions the supremacy of Vedas. So, therefore, this distinction is also significant. Then there is another way to look at it, is otherworldly versus this worldly. It is believed that the Brahmanic tradition has a different world view, different way to interpret the world, and particularly this entire discourse of dharma and the karma, that whatever you do deeds in this world basically enable you to go for salvation after death, and therefore there are number of features of this, we will touch upon this, including transmigration of soul, etc., etc. So, there is other worldly dimension, that whatever you do in this world is simply in order to achieve something in other world. So, therefore, this one dimension, and then this entire Shramanic tradition or the heterodox tradition is often referred as this worldly, and therefore, materialism is important characteristic of this tradition, that it basically repudiates such worldview, which says that whatever you do here, you will basically reap the benefits in afterlife, after death, or in the other world. So, therefore, that is another thing. And next is a spiritual versus material, that one is a spiritual, another is material, but in fact, there may be some difference of opinion on this, but nonetheless we find that these are the essential ways through which the scholars, interpreters have looked at these two traditions. Now, so far as coming to this interpretation part, that how people have interpreted this entire tradition called classical tradition or the Brahmanic tradition. Now, Panini, the grammarian, he believes that Nastic is one who does not believe in other world, and Astic believes in it, and therefore, he believes that the classical tradition is a tradition, or the Brahmanic tradition is a tradition which has a otherworldly perspective. Some post-Buddhist, but of course, the pre-Christian traditions believe that meaning of Astic as one who believes in infallibility of Vedas, and therefore, those who are characterized as Gnostics, they question the Vedas. So, therefore, this is how they look at this Astic-Gnostic distinction. In fact, Manu, the lawgiver who wrote that famous digest Manu Smriti, in fact, categorically states that Gnostics vilify Vedas, and therefore, Veda becomes the rallying point or the defining point so far as this Astic-Gnostic distinction is concerned. Now, one thing is very clear, that there has emerged a tradition in Indian political thought, which basically has given certain criteria to define or interpret orthodoxy. And one important criterion is acceptance of absolute validity of Vedas. If any tradition which goes in totally establishing the supremacy or infallibility of Vedas, that tradition is the orthodox tradition, the Brahmanic tradition, and therefore, the classical tradition from this point of view. Now, of course, there are some confusions here if we go by these interpretations and these classifications, and confusion stems from the fact that there are some systems which are usually treated as orthodox in Vedic sense, from philosophical point of view, have nothing to do with Vedas, and both in form as well as in content. For example, there are some schools of philosophy which we will basically see later. In fact, they do not go by this characterization that is infallibility of Vedas, or those strictly go by the basically the canons of Vedas. So, therefore, there is some confusion. Conventional classification therefore has obvious limitation. The classification we have just seen, astic, nastic, then this orthodox, heterodox, and otherworldly, this worldly. But then there, of course, there is one advantage also, and we should not basically run away from that, or basically we cannot ignore that advantage, and that advantage pertains to the fact that it indicates about the great role of the Vedic authority in Indian political thought. So, therefore, this is one important dimension we should remember. That advantage is that it basically tells us about the supremacy of Vedic authority in Indian political thought, and that is why basically one feels that the conventional classification has some advantage. Now, coming to these orthodox traditions. Now, these orthodox traditions of course are normally associated with 6 different systems of philosophy, and most of them are declared Vedic. For example, one is called Purva Mimamsa. Now, this school is essentially school of interpretation. Then there is a second school of philosophy which is called Uttar Mimamsa, and this is basically the Vedanta philosophy. Then you have the third school of philosophy called Shank, and it deals with the issue of consciousness. And the fourth is Yoga, and it is basically a discourse of practical discipline. And basically the next is the Nyaya, which basically essentially believes in methodology of debate and discussion, and it deals also with the question of logic. And finally, you have Vaisesik, which focuses on the basic categories of real life like substance, quality, universal, etc., etc. Therefore, we find that these 6 schools of philosophy are normally referred as some schools belonging to this orthodox tradition. Now, what happens that there is one important point to remember in context of this orthodox tradition, particularly about these 6 schools of philosophy, and that is the authority of Vedas is decisive only in case of the first 2, that is Mimamsa and Vedanta, and it does not apply to the others in the same proportion. Therefore, the point which I mentioned earlier, that this entire attempt to club all those schools of philosophy or all traditions of thinking as something related to this Vedic tradition, and therefore orthodox tradition is also referred as a homogeneous tradition, sometimes creates problem, because even if we look at these 6 schools of philosophy, we find that only the authority of Vedas is decisive in case of the first 2, that is Mimamsa and Vedanta, but it does not apply in the same proportion so far as the other 4 schools are concerned. Now, therefore, after looking at these 6 schools of philosophy, which have of course influenced this entire thinking or entire tradition of Indian philosophy, Indian thinking, Indian society, Indian culture over the years, and therefore they become very important so far as understanding the classical tradition in India is concerned. Now, therefore the next question which stares us in our face is the question of Vedas. What is Vedas? Now, so far as the orthodox tradition goes, Vedas is considered to be knowledge par excellence. There is nothing above Vedas, or there is nothing as sacrosanct as knowledge or wisdom, or basically the messages which are basically coming through the Vedas, knowledge of Vedas, scriptures of Vedas. Now, it is also referred as a sacred and revealed knowledge, but when it is basically broken into the concrete terms, it stands for the vast body of literature handed down through oral tradition known as Shruti, because Vedas are also referred as Shruti tradition, oral tradition, or a memory tradition. Things were supposed to be memorized. And there is another interesting aspect about the Shruti tradition, that because things had to be memorized, and therefore what happened that in Sanskritic texts, mostly these texts are in Sanskrit. In fact, many scholars believe that they were highly economical so far as the usage of verb was concerned, and some of the differences of opinion or interpretations which happened later were largely on account of the fact that the verbs were inserted. So, because initially in order to make it shorter, the hymns, the paragraph or the verses, in order to make it shorter, verbs were dispensed with, and the subsequent interpreters only inserted verbs, and that of course led to changes in its meaning, and this is how the entire issue of interpretation came, so far as this Vedic tradition is concerned. Now, of course, one thing is to be remembered, that this Vedic tradition and some the texts or the hymns or the verses, or one can say this entire tradition is not homogeneous in style and content. Now, of course, the earliest example of such thing one finds in terms of oral songs, or particularly the eulogies of those who call themselves Aryans or Arya, because this is how this entire tradition comes into existence. So, Vedas or Shruti, as it is, as I was mentioning, the retentive memory, it has to be memorized. Basically what happens that it was transmitted to the later generation. Now, old oral compositions of this tradition are also called mantras, and they are one great division of Vedas. Mantras are perhaps the sub part of the Vedas. In fact, collection of mantras are basically referred as Vedas. Now, apart from this mantras, there is another dimension or another feature which is to be remembered, and that is Brahmanas. Now, it is in prose form, the mantras in the verse form, but the Brahmanas in the prose form, and it came much later. Now, mantras. Now, of course, this Brahmanas sometimes create confusion also, because this Brahmanic tradition, sometimes people people believe that perhaps it refers to this Brahmanic tradition, or Brahmanic tradition draws its name from this Brahmanas, but that is not the case. Now, the mantras, as I was referring to, that collection of mantras become the Vedas, and therefore, what we find, that these mantras have come to us in 4 compilation, or what is known as Samhitas, and the most earliest perhaps Samhita is the Rigveda Samhita, and then you have the Samved Samhita, then you have Atharvaved Samhita, and then you have Yajurveda Samhita. Sometimes they are simply referred as Rigveda, Samved, Atharvaved and Yajurveda. And the Rigveda, of course, is the oldest and the foundation of the Vedic literature, as it is normally understood. Now, this Rigveda is something which consists of hymns dedicated to different sages, and are expressions of everyday desire of human beings, like desire for cattle, desire for food, desire for safety, desire for victory, desire for health, progeny, etc., etc. So, therefore, they are available in form of hymns, and they are they are offered to different sages, and they are basically in some form expressions of human desire of any society or the primitive society. So, therefore, this is how these hymns or these mantras are basically available to us, which go into making this entire Vedic literature through these 4 different samhitas which I mentioned: Rigveda, Samved, Atharvaved and Yajurveda. Of course, the later hymns which were perhaps inserted much later are not in the beginning of this entire process. In fact, there are also cosmological speculations, and there are a lot of philosophical content in it, though which is not true about the earlier form of those hymns, and therefore, the later cosmological speculations have given rise to a lot of interpretations about understanding about science and understanding about philosophy and so on and so forth, that this Vedic literature tells us that how they were ahead of their time, and they knew different dimensions of science, philosophy and so on and so forth. Now, apart from these mantras, as I was mentioning you have also the Brahmanas, and these Brahmanas, as A.L. Basam, one of the important observer, commentator on Indian tradition, Indian philosophy, Indian history, in his Wonder That Was India, he writes that these Brahmanas are looked on as appendices to the Vedas and mystical Upanishad, which in turn are appendices of the Brahmanas, and they together complete the Vedic literature. So, therefore, these mantras and these Brahmanas, they together complete this Vedic literature. Now, A.L. Basham also mentions that the material of Brahmanas look back in main to the period between 800 to 600 BC. That is the time period the historians are trying to fix for this entire process of the compilation of these Brahmanas. But instead of going into this historicity of these things, what I would like to mention that this this entire Vedic literature, as it is commonly referred, and which is basically the basis on which the classical Indian tradition or classical Indian philosophy, or what is also known as the Brahmanic tradition, is sought to be studied and interpreted. Now, the sources to study this Brahmanic tradition is also important, that how people have tried to study this this Brahmanic tradition, where from they draw their resources, or what they make there the main basis for their interpretation and of their entire understanding so far as the Brahmanic tradition is concerned. Now, one thing is very clear, that so far sources to study this Brahmanic tradition are concerned, there are four important sources. One is the Shruti, the Vedas, and the second is of course Smritis, which comes later. Then you have Shastras, and then you have the Purans. And one thing is interesting about all four, that what comes later is less definitive and more speculative. So, therefore, so far as this tradition is concerned, it attaches more importance in terms of finality, in terms of authority, in terms of definitiveness to one which precedes the earlier. So, therefore, the Shruti is more definitive, more authoritative than Smritis. Smritis are more authoritative and definitive than Shastras, and Shastras are more definitive and authoritative than Purans. So, this is how these four sources are looked at in this tradition. Now, of course, there is another distinction which is also made to so far as the sources are concerned, that is textual and non-textual, that there are two ways to interpret this Brahmanic tradition. One is to go by the text available or text dealing with this tradition, this philosophy, this entire worldview, entire framework originating from certain texts. So, this textual view or the textual source is considered quite important so far as this Brahmanic tradition is concerned. So, far this textual thing is concerned, it is believed that the Vedas are perhaps the most important source so far as the text is concerned to understand this Brahmanic tradition, and Vedas deal with the universal principles, the universal laws of society and many other things. Now, Smritis, it is believed that they deal with particular, unlike Vedas which deal with universal, and therefore, they are in form of digest. For example, the most important digest from the point of view of this Brahmanic tradition is the Manu Smriti, the digest of laws given by Manus. So, therefore, you have this another type of the text available within this tradition, so far the textual tradition is concerned. Then you have also, there are many digests of rituals, and they are called Karma Kand or basically Karma Shastra, which tells you about that how the rituals have to be performed, how different rituals in order to propitiate God, or in order to basically discharge one's duties, or in order to keep track of this entire framework of this classical tradition, certain karmas have to be performed, certain duties have to be performed, and there are texts governing those duties, and those duties and those texts or those digests are known as Karma Kand. Then, of course, apart from this textual tradition, there is also a non-textual tradition in this tradition, and this non-textual tradition is equally important, and it comes mostly from the little tradition. If the first one can be referred as a great tradition in sociological parlance, then the second tradition can be referred as the little tradition. So, this is how we can say that the sources are there to study the Brahmanic tradition. So far we have looked at that what is this Brahmanic tradition, what are the debates so far as the traditions, the conflict between the two traditions is concerned, that is Brahmanic or Shramanic or orthodox and heterodox. We have also looked at the essential components of this tradition, and then we have tried to see that how the sources are available, on what basis one can interpret these sources so far as the Brahmanic tradition is concerned. Okay. basically, we have to see that how this Indian tradition or Indian entire philosophy or Indian political thoughts revolves around these two traditions, the Brahminic and the Shramanic tradition. And the Brahminic and Shramanic traditions are perhaps key for our understanding or key to understand this entire political thinking in India so far as ancient period is concerned. But that does not mean that its impact or influence we do not find in contemporary life or contemporary world or contemporary political thought. I will also refer to that how it has influenced whole host of scholars and generations in modern period as well. But one thing is important, this Brahminic tradition, as it is known as orthodox or classical tradition, essentially gets associated with the Vedic tradition. The four different type of this Vedas which I was just mentioning, Rig Veda, Sam Veda, Yadur Veda, etc., etc. And then also I will one should remember that the sources to this study this Brahminic tradition are of different types, and the two important types are very important. One is the textual, another is non-textual, and the sociologists may call the textual tradition influencing the great tradition of culture and in a life in India, but the non-textual may be called as something which has emerged out of a interaction or interplay or dialectical relationship between the particular and universal, the practice and the theory, or one can say the little and the great traditions, and therefore the non-textual is equally important. And this non-textual tradition or the little tradition, as one may like to call it, basically pertains to the Vyavhar or customs, what is called customs, that how people's customs essentially influenced and determined by this normative framework given by this classical tradition or given by these textual discourse of this tradition. Also sometimes gives new ideas, new framework, and therefore they are gradually incorporated in this great tradition, and therefore this incorporation ultimately results into a combination of little and great traditions, and this is how this entire classical tradition survives or has survived over the ages. Now, Bhikhu Parekh, one political theorist, interpreter, or observer or scholar on Indian political thought, he believes that Hindu political philosophers conceptualize political life in India in terms of the two important components of the normative framework, that is Dand and Dharma, or one can say Dharma and Dand, and both complement each other. That is, without Dand, you can't have Dharma, and without Dharma the Dand cannot basically be thought of. So, therefore, Dharma and Dand, these two important themes he believes that have been the central focal themes of Indian political thinking so far as the politics, society and human life is concerned. Now, he believes that these the Dharma, or basically the discourse on Dharma, which ultimately become the Dharma Shastras, are the moralist discourse. It talks about ethical principles of society. It gives the moral rules through which people's life are to be is to be conducted. And then the Dand, which basically ultimately results into a discourse on power, the mechanics of power, rule, government, and more mundane thing. And for example, Arthashastra is one such discourse on Dand, because Arthashastra is a discourse, Arthashastra of Kautilya, in fact is a discourse on the mechanics of power. So, therefore, one is idealist discourse, another is a realist discourse, and both complement each other and both go hand in hand. So, this is how we have to see this moral and material coexisting in Indian thinking side by side. Of course, this Dharma thing is a little bit more nuanced and complicated in Indian discourse, because it is also believed by many scholars that this entire Western political thinking or Western political thought can be understood, or it revolves around this question of truth, whereas the Indian political thought revolves around this question of Dharma. What is Dharma? And Dharma at times does basically get translated into faith or religion. It is much more than that. It's sometimes duties, sometimes it basically approximate to what is known as truth. So, therefore, very nuanced and complicated understanding of this Dharma. So, therefore, this is Bhikkhu Parekh. Now, coming to this, the feature of this Brahmanic discourse. So far, we have seen the sources through which we can approach this Brahmanic discourse. We have seen the debate or interpretations of this Brahmanic thing, that what is after all this Brahmanic tradition. Now, we have to see that what are the features, and normally it is argued that there are three important features of this Brahmanic discourse. One feature, it is believed, is the feature of continuity, and the second feature, it is argued, is the feature of holism, and the third feature, it is argued, is the feature of hierarchy. And around these three things or three themes, one can say, that this entire Brahmanic tradition revolves or basically survives, thrives on these three important features. Now, Louis Dumont, a very eminent French sociologist writing on Indian society, particularly caste system, in his famous book Homo Hierarchicus, he basically tries to find out certain rules of this entire tradition, that is the classical tradition. And of course, many people believe that his entire interpretation is textual, he does not take into account the Vyavhar, the customs part, that how it operates, but his normative framework he is basically dealing with. And he argues, Louis Dumont, that the distinction between status and power within the broad framework of holism and hierarchy are important characteristics of this Brahmanic discourse. Now, distinction between status and power is quite significant within the framework of caste and varnas, that one which wields power does not enjoy status. That means the Brahmins are at the top so far as this status scale is concerned. In terms of the spiritual power, the Brahmins are considered the wielder of spiritual power, and the Kshatriyas are considered the wielder of material power. So, therefore, status and power are disjuncted, they are not conjoined together, and this disjunction also is based on a kind of alliance, and this way we find that a larger holism or hierarchy is created, hierarchical society is created. That is why the book is called Homo Hierarchicus. In fact, is pitted against Homo Equalis of the Western worldview or Western tradition. So, therefore, according to Louis Dumont, we can say that distinction between status and power, and this disjunction between status and power and holism and hierarchy are the important features. Now, Bhikkhu Parekh, he argues that political authorities, as I mentioned, essentially rests on this dharma and danda. But one thing is very important here, that this entire Brahmanic tradition in India believes in two things: continuity and change, change within the broad framework of this hierarchy, broad framework of holism, and therefore order is very important, because entire thing is meant to establish and continue that order. There should not be any disorder, and therefore this entire discourse of karma and dharma is essentially meant to perpetuate this order and this continuity in this system. Now, this order is both normative and social, and normative and social basically go hand in hand. That is another unique feature, a special feature, that how the material and spiritual are conjoined together in this entire tradition. Now, this order, both normative and social, they are maintained through hierarchy, holism and continuity, and both in secular and sacred terms. Now, so far as hierarchy is concerned, hierarchy is basically ethos, and there are four different types of hierarchies so far as this ethos is concerned in society, and this is how order is maintained, this is how continuity is maintained, and this is how the change is also basically ordered within this broad holistic perspective. The first hierarchy is the hierarchy of role institutionalization, that is called Varna and Jati, fourfold division of society. The second hierarchy is goal orientation, that is called Purusharth. And the third hierarchy is the hierarchy of charismatic endowments, it is called Guna, that individual attributes. And the fourth is of course called the hierarchy of changing cultural cycles, and it is life stages, that is ashram. Now, what is Varna? Of course, as all of us know, that Varna is the normative framework of caste. This is how the caste system gets its sustenance or legitimacy from this normative framework of Varna, and therefore the fourfold distinction. But the Varna interestingly is also legitimized through this Guna, another hierarchy of Guna. There are four different types of Guna within this classical tradition, the Brahmanic tradition: Shatav, Rajas, Tamas
and therefore the three different types of guna. The sattva is virtue, the rajas is action, tamas is dullness, and therefore these attributes decide that what type of vocation or what type of role one will perform in the society. And this Varna system, therefore, one can say survives or thrives on this definition of guna. Guna is not only important for deciding the caste and the varnas, but also important for kingship discourse, that how kings have to have this sattva, that is virtue, and virtues only enable them to rule. So sometimes it is reminiscent of what Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle talked about earlier. The next hierarchy is the hierarchy of Purusharth, and you have those four different endowments, as I mentioned, that the goal attainment, or one can say that this Purusharth is nothing but goal orientation, that the four goals of human being in life. What are those fourfold goal orientation? One is the Kam, another is Arth, next is the Dharma, and the fourth is the Moksha. And therefore, the last perhaps is the most noble and the most ideal. So therefore, goal attainment at appropriate stages of life, and this is how the Dharma is normatively translated into action. So therefore, from Varna, Guna to Purusharth, and then the fourth hierarchy, which is equally important, and this is how we have to say it, that how four are intertwined with each other. The fourth is the ashram, that is division of life. Now the fourfold division of life, that is brahmacharya, grihast, vanprastha and sannyas, the four different types, and hierarchy of goal orientation and hierarchy of life stages, basically they are intertwined with each other, and this is how this dharma framework of this Brahmanic tradition comes into existence and governs the society. Now these four hierarchies decide the continuity and change to maintain order in society. So therefore, we feel that this continuity and order are maintained through this holistic perspective, through emerging through these four different hierarchies and how they are related with each other. Now continuity is also maintained through discourse of karma and transmigration of soul, that whatever you do in this world ultimately would decide your next life. So therefore, soul never dies. This is perhaps essential component of this philosophy, and therefore soul survives the corporal death of human beings, and therefore what happens, that it transmigrates in the next world, and therefore your deeds are carried forward, and therefore this is how the continuity and order are maintained within this perspective. Now moksha is of course is ultimate ideal, because perhaps this is the last and final and noble thing, and it is of course is to be attained through bhakti, jnana and yoga, and therefore what we find that this is how holism and hierarchy come into play so far as this Brahmanic tradition is concerned. Of course, many scholars, many critics believe that in this Brahmanic tradition, under the spell of holism, individual autonomy, individual rights are denied, and only duties are emphasized. Therefore, individual does not have any space, any autonomy within this framework. Of course, later the concept of sannyasi also emerged, because the renouncer, which was not there earlier, the sannyas, how we will see later that how the Sramanic tradition, the exchange between the Sramanic and Brahmanic traditions led to incorporation of certain new features from this tradition called Sramanic, which was revolting against this Brahmanic tradition, and therefore the concept of sannyas as part of the fourfold life cycle came from the Sramanic tradition, and the concept of sannyasi as the individual renouncer going outside society was a new dimension, basically going against this earlier framework, normative framework, where individual didn't have any space of action, but sannyasi does have. So this is how we have to see this hierarchy. Then the change. Now how the change is explained, how change is permitted, how change is understood, and interestingly the change is also hierarchically understood in this Brahmanic tradition or the classical tradition, and it is understood in terms of cyclical movement of time, that is called Kal, and the day of Brahmas, Kal is measured, the time is measured in terms of the days of Brahmas. 4,320 million earthly years are subdivided into 14 manvantras, and this is how the time is calculated in this tradition. Now, there are 4 different cyclical, of course, time has a cyclical movement, not a linear movement like West. Particularly here, the cyclical understanding of time is divided in terms of Krita, that is a spiritual, the time of a spiritual being, Treta, that is, of course, spiritualism still continues, but not in the same proportion, the Dwapar, which is the age of mixed spiritualism, and the Kali Yuga, that is the debased time, perhaps when the entire normative framework of this entire tradition is subverted, and therefore, it is a debased time, and therefore it is called Kali Yuga. Now, what happened, that Kali Yuga, what happens, the divine incarnation comes or takes birth to rescue this entire order, and this is how this order is restored, and therefore the cyclical movement takes place, and against this spiritual period or spiritual being comes into existence. Now, therefore, what we find that the Kali Yuga is the only yuga or any time where human beings are basically arrive on this scene. Otherwise, all other yugas, all other period, you have the superhumans and gods. So, therefore, you have another hierarchy coming into existence so far time is concerned, that is human and the superhuman, because the other yugas, other time only tell you about the superhumans and God, but only Kali Yuga tell you about human beings. Now, there are number of criticisms which are made against this classical Brahmanic tradition. It is one, that it is society centered. Number 2, it is inegalitarian because it justifies the caste and varna, and the third is apologetic because it was always meant to legitimize and justify the kingly power, the monarchical system. Of course, they are familiar with the republican system, but mostly they talked of monarchies. They ignored conflict, they only talked of order, therefore status quoist. And finally, what we find, that as a reaction to this tradition, you have the birth of a different rebellious tradition, that is known as Shramanic tradition. So far as the readings for this Brahmanic tradition is concerned, or the Shramanic tradition is concerned, we will discuss later. But to begin with, or to discuss the Shramanic tradition, a rebellious tradition, a tradition which questioned and interrogated all the features which I have discussed here, particularly hierarchy. We have discussed the entire system of varnas, the life cycle. We have discussed the infallibility of Vedas. We have discussed that how otherworldly pursuit of human beings in name of dharma and karma. So, therefore, the Shramanic tradition questioned one by one all these features which characterize this Brahmanic tradition of political thought in India. Now, when we talk of Shramanic tradition, Shram has 2 different connotations. One pertains to the labor, another pertains to the Brahman, that is wandering, that people who wander. So, therefore, normally when we talk of Shramanic tradition, we basically refer to 2 important schools of thought in India. One is Jainism and another is Buddhism. But in fact, interestingly, Shramanic tradition is also known as heterodox, as I was referring to earlier, that one is orthodox, another is heterodox. Under heterodox, on the rubric of this heterodoxy, what we find that Shramanic tradition is discussed with reference to 2-3 more schools of thought. And for example, sometimes we find that the materialist like Charvak, or for example, Ajivijik or the Goshala, others, they are also clubbed together with the Shramanic tradition. But nonetheless, in fact, for many scholars, the ideal way to characterize or bring all of them together would be to put under the category of heterodox tradition, not Shramanic tradition. So, as far as Shramanic tradition is concerned, it essentially referred to Jainism and Buddhism. Now, of course, as I was mentioning, that they are heterodox, they are not orthodox. They question the orthodoxy of this Brahmanical discourse. They question the atheism, or they question the theism, and therefore, of the sort which this Brahmanical tradition or the Vedic tradition talked of, and therefore, at times they are also referred as Gnostic. And therefore, I mentioned initially that how Panini and Manu, they believe that they vilify Vedas, and therefore, they are Gnostics. So, but Gnostic Astic characterization is little bit problematic, because what this classical or this orthodox tradition feels that Shramanic tradition was Gnostic, and the Shramanic tradition feels that the orthodox tradition was Gnostic. But nonetheless, when we talk of Astic and Gnostic, Astic pertains to orthodox, and the Gnostic pertains to the Shramanic. Then the materialist versus spiritualism, because one thing no one can deny, that they were talking about this world, not the other world, not life after death, but basically the causes and the miseries of life in this world. For example, this is how Buddhism, the Gautam became the Buddhas. So therefore, this is another important dimension. Now, so far as the features of Shramnik tradition is concerned, the first important feature is that they are opposed to Brahmanic tradition. All the features we have discussed: holism, continuity, change, 4 different hierarchies, infallibility of Vedas, caste system, faith in God. So all these 3 things basically they controvert. Now, they are opposed to orthodoxy, as I have already mentioned. Now, the 3 important features which stand out so far this Shramnik tradition is concerned. One is the denial of Vedas, because for classical tradition there is nothing beyond Vedas, and therefore when we come to the modern times, as I will mention in the end, that how they have influenced the contemporary political or the modern Indian political thinking as well, both tradition, the classical, this orthodox and heterodox. We can see that on the one hand, those who want to go back to Vedas, for example, Dayananda Saraswati during the freedom movement days, the colonial period, or those who want to question the Vedas, those who want to question Smritis, those who want to question Shastras, and those who basically question this entire caste and Varna system, they take recourse to this Shramnik tradition. For example, these days we can find that the Dalit discourse or the feminist discourse or such discourses for emancipation in society, they often refer to the Buddhism and so many other discourses, the philosophical schools which talked about equality, egalitarianism and so on and so forth. And the third, the rejection of God. They have a different take on this creator, the God, and therefore it completely is different from what the Brahmanical discourse talks of. Now, Jainism, Buddhism, materialism of Charvak and Ajivik, that is Goshala, they are normally referred as belonging to the Shramnik tradition, but as I mentioned, that Jainism and Buddhism decidedly, without any confusion or any questioning, become part of this tradition. Now, to begin with Jainism, the Mahavir, the 24th Tirthankar, is considered to be the most important philosopher of this tradition. Of course, he was the 24th Tirthankar, and the Parashnath was the 23rd, and Rishabdev was the first. Now, Mahavir, the term comes from from this meaning that great hero, Mahabir, great hero. So this is how he is known as Mahavir. Now, he was contemporary of Buddha, and Jainism is basically a kind of discourse which is ascetic in nature. It believes in kind of spiritualism. It talks of 5 different vows: abjure killing, abjure stealing, abjure lying, abjure sexual activity, and abjure possession of property. So it is an ascetic tradition believing in non-violence and self-control. So therefore, kind of self-mortification, one can say, brat, and basically self-purification. These are the essential attributes of this tradition. So non-violence is one important dimension, and one reason many scholars, philosophers, historians, social scientists, they believe that one of the reasons for the rise of the Shramnik tradition was the kind of violence which was being perpetrated in the name of rituals during this Vedic period, the post-Vedic period, that led to kind of a kind of disquiet or protest in the society, along with the caste system and the oppression of women, and therefore these 2 different sects emerged as a kind of protest, voice of protest in the society, which talked of equality, which questioned caste, which questioned Varna, which basically attacked violence of any sort, which talked of vegetarianism, and therefore it drew lot of support in the society, particularly the merchant sections of society, and therefore a material interpretation of this rise of Buddhism and Jainism is attributed to the kind of practices which were basically rampant those days in name of this ritual or spiritualism, or the kind of attempt which was being made to please God by animal sacrifices and so on and so forth. So therefore, Jainism also believes in non-violence like Buddhism. Now, Jainism, interestingly, emerged because he was contemporary of Buddha, emerged in the Magad, the contemporary Bihar, and then spread in different parts, particularly Gujarat, Rajasthan, and even in the southern states. It is also believed that Chandragupta Maurya, after the great famine in the Magadhan Empire, he took to Jainism and basically relinquished power and went to southern part of India. So, therefore, Jainism had a following in all across the country gradually, and it has survived till today. Of course, one thing is interestingly gradually, and we find not only gradually but initially also, the kind of attack which we feel that Buddhism mounts on caste system, Jainism perhaps doesn't, and therefore, the two important dimensions, the god, temples and the caste, which basically the classical tradition essentially believed in, and Buddhism completely rejects it. But Jainism, we find that gradually got affected by these things. So, therefore, you have temples, Jain temples. We find Jain is treated, Mahavir is treated as God, and then we also find that the caste, the Tirthankars were also gradually associated with this Varna and the caste thing. So, therefore, the kind of protest which Jainism made against this classical, the Brahminic tradition, some of the protests gradually got subdued, and therefore, we find that some of the features are also within the Jainism. Now, in philosophy, we find that Jainism has played tremendous role. For example, the importance which it attached to the relativity of truth, and therefore, this Anekantavad and the Syadvad, the two schools which Jainism works with, is of tremendous value, so much so that Gandhi was also influenced by the Syadvadi doctrine of Jainism. Now, on the one hand, the Upanishadic tradition, the classical Brahminic tradition talks of ultimate reality, Buddhism talks of eternal flux, and Jainism talks of compromise, the partial truth, permanence and change. So, therefore, Syadvad as dialectics, which talks of maybe or that there is some truth in every statement or every reality, basically is one important component of this Jainist doctrine, which has influenced whole host of philosophers, theorists and thinkers in later period. Like Jainism, Buddhism is also a critique of the metaphysical being of the Brahminic discourse. It is also a discourse of escape from cycle of rebirth. It is a discourse on dukkha, and dukkha, it believes, is largely because of this birth and rebirth cycle, and therefore, the only way out is escape. Now, it is against the caste system of Brahminism. It wants a middle path between extreme austerity of Jainism and hedonism of materialism. Therefore, Madhyam Marg is perhaps one important dimension of the Buddhist discourse. Now, gradually Buddhism from wandering sect became a kind of settled community through monastery, and this was important changes. The features of Buddhism, of course, like Jainism, is ahimsa, moksha, rejection of Vedas, denial of creator like Brahmanism, no belief in rituals and no belief in caste system. So, therefore, what we find that we have the Brahminic and the Shramanic traditions have a mixed legacy in modern times. On the one hand, we find that the Brahminic tradition was sought to be resurrected during colonial freedom movement by Dayanand and so on and so forth. But there are also attempts of reforms like Ram Mohan and others. And subsequently, we find that Aurobindo, Vivekananda and many others talked of that classical tradition, but within reform framework, whereas the reform tradition also continued. And so, far as Shramanic tradition is concerned, in contemporary times we find that it has made a powerful comeback. Earlier, of course, it disappeared from India and spread in different parts of Asia, Southeast Asia and Far East. But in modern times we find that it has made a powerful comeback, and Buddhism, therefore, through neo-Buddhists and particularly through this Dalit discourse, is basically trying to again problematize this question of equality, egalitarianism, justice, and critiquing this entire Varna hierarchy and the caste system in India. So, therefore, we find that its ancient Indian political thought through this Shramanic and the classical tradition are quite alive today, and they are showing their impact on different traditions and different schools of thought in modern times in India. I will stop here.
On that note, I would like to thank sir for this very enriching discussion, and I would like to thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.